Okay, so the first of the adapters we want to look at or talk about is the SQL adapter. Now, a Worklight SQL adapter is designed to communicate with any SQL data source. So whichever one you want to interact with, just feel free. I'm sure it's part of the list. It supports MySQL, it supports Oracle, there's the Apache DB, and then there's the DB2 also, the DB2 by IBM. Okay, so the plain SQL queries or stored procedures can be used. So we can use plain SQL queries, or we can even call on stored procedures. So we've looked at the supporting databases, the MySQL, Oracle, Apache DB, and DB2. Now we would need to download the JDBC connector driver for the specific database type and add that to the library directory of the Worklight project. So you need to take note of that. For each and every one of the database sources that you want to connect to, there is a corresponding, or you need the JDBC connector for that. So you need a driver for that, and you should remember to drop that in the lib folder or in the library folder in your Worklight project. So the structure of the SQL adapter, following a similar structure like the other ones, we have an XML which holds the description and the definitions of our procedures, and then we have the JavaScript, which is the implementation. Okay, so you can see from this project explorer, we can see that here we have it's an SQL adapter that is connecting to the DB data source. So we have my DB implementation.js, and we have my DB.xml. Okay. Then you need to proceed to the connectivity settings, because we are talking to a data source, a database. We will need the database connectivity settings put in place so that that could be successful. Now, the 4 parameters that you would need to configure in your XML file are the driver class, the database URL, the username, and the password. I mean, if you have done any application, built any application where you need to connect to a database, you realize that these parameters are key: the database URL, the username, the password, and all of that. It's a similar thing we are actually trying to do here in our XML file. And we can see how that will look like in the XML file in the snapshot that is being shown. The driver class is put between a driver tag, and then we have the URL also between the URL tags, and then we have the username and then the password. And we talked about some benefits, and one of them is the load constraints. So here you can see that that has been specified to 5 maximum concurrent connections per node. So we have 5. Okay. Now, after that is done in the XML file, a procedure must be declared. So we would declare the procedure in the XML file. Here we have 2 procedures being declared in our example. We have the get account transaction. So let's say that we are talking to some banking system and we want to get account transactions as one of our procedures. And then for the second procedure, we want to get the particular user that is trying to access the system. So we have these 2 procedures defined in the XML file. And then when you look below, there's a snapshot of the implementation in JavaScript. Here again, we are making use of the wl.server because this is residing on the server. And so instead of calling client if it was a phone or on the client machine, here we are calling on the server to invoke what the necessary functions that we need to do. So here we have the invoke SQL statement, and we put in the prepared statement, and then the parameters follows that. And then you can see that in this case we have implemented both of them, the get account transaction and the get user. Okay. Like we said, it could also be a call to stored procedures. So there's that functionality also. Now, to execute an SQL query, we need to prepare an SQL query with WL server create SQL statements. Now this API must always be called outside the function. And then we secondly need to add parameters if required. And then thirdly, we use the WL server invoke SQL statement to invoke the prepared queries. So this snapshot is also showing us the first step, which we are saying that it should be done outside the function where we are creating or preparing the statements. And we can see our SQL is a normal SQL that you would write. Select transaction ID, blah, 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 from a particular table. And then when we now implement the procedure, we are calling the invoke SQL statement, and then the parameters, whatever we need to pass, which we are holding as a place with the question marks, we'll pass that, and that gets filled. We are using a prepared statement because we want to avoid SQL injection, and that is one of the features that we are getting from our Worklight, which is very robust. Then we'll now move to the JavaScript file for the SQL procedure. So to execute a stored SQL procedure, we'll use the WL server invoke SQL stored procedure. So in a case where it's a stored procedure we want to call on, previously where it was raw SQL, so we use the invoke SQL statement. But if it's a procedure, we want to use invoke SQL stored procedure API. Now we use this to execute the stored procedure. Now we specify an SQL stored procedure name as an invocation parameter, and then we add the parameters if required. So just like we had for the other one, we are now putting the procedure name, get accounts by user ID, so that's going to be the stored procedure, and then the parameters that we need to pass to that stored procedure, we specify that in the parameters aspect of it, and that gets executed for us. Now we want to talk about the WL adapters invocation results. So the results that are retrieved are JSON objects. Now we have the is successful, which defines whether the invocation was successful, and then we have the result set, which is an array of returned records. Okay, so this is how the invocation results would look like. We have the is successful parameter telling us whether the operation was successful, which is true, and then we have the result set. So if it's true, we have a result set, and that fetches us the required data, and we can follow and process that. If it's false, also is going to notify us. So down in the session, in this session, we are going to talk about the invocation data, and we'll see how the error and everything would come up. We want to now jump quickly to the HTTP adapters and talk about the HTTP adapters. So that one would help us to talk to RESTful and SOAP-based services. We can read structured HTTP sources, for example, RSS feeds. It allows us to send an HTTP request via GET or POST requests are supported. And then we're also able to retrieve data from the response headers and the body. It's customizable by server-side JavaScript. Retrieved data can be in the following formats: XML, HTML, JSON, and plain text. Okay. So how do we create an HTTP adapter? We'll follow the same scenario we used in creating our previous adapter, which is the SQL. And then instead of choosing SQL adapter now, we'll choose HTTP adapter. After that is created, with a structure, is going to give us 3 files. We have the XML file, the JavaScript file, and then the XSL file. Okay. Now, it's optional, the XSL, so we could use that to filter received records and fields. Okay. Again, we'll need to specify connectivity parameters or details. So we'll use the XML file to set up these connectivity settings. The first one would be the protocol. Is it a secured HTTP or is it the unsecured HTTP? The domain in which we want to access, we also specify that. And then the port, the TCP port. So you could see how you can see that you can actually see all of that in the connectivity tag in our XML, how all of these are specified. Here we are connecting to an RSS feed from CNN in this example, and the port is port 80. And we can specify other things like the maximum concurrent connections per node and all of that. Okay, so the URL is used for the invocation data when we want to talk to, let's say, a RESTful service. If you know how a RESTful URL looks like, you could actually, we have the path elements at part of the URL and then the query string. So parts of the URL are constants. Like we'll have your HTTP example.com, that is going to be constant. So they are declared in the XML file. The other parts of the URL can be parameterized. So we can actually change that as and when we want to access a particular resource. The URL parts that can be parameterized are the path elements and then the query string parameters. So we have the path elements here for this particular URL. The rest customers can change, and then the cust ID, which is the customer ID, also which is the query string, can also change. So these ones can keep changing as and when we want to use the adapter. Again, like we saw previously, and which is going to be the same for the rest of the adapters we talk about, the procedure definitions are declared in the XML file, and an implementation is done in the JavaScript file. And in the JavaScript file, where we implement the procedures, some methods are required. So the required invocation parameters are the method, the return content type, and the path. So these parameters are required. Then the procedure can be parameterized at runtime. So based on at runtime, we can choose what we want to do. And so here we see that the method here, which could be a get or post, the return content type, what we want to actually receive, we said that that could be in several formats. We could have the JSON, we could have plain, we could have XML, and so on. And then the path, which we looked at in the URL, where the path, the portion which we call the path, can also be specified. Then we'll now call that by calling on the server API, WL server.invoke HTTP, and then we pass in this input or invocation data. Okay. Now, in the case where we want to perform some transformation or filtering, here we want to use the XSL, and that's where we would want to specify all of that. So the XSL transformation can be applied to the received data. What we need to do is specify the transformation options in the procedure invocation input parameters. So here you can see the transformation option. We are saying that the type is an XSL file, and the file name is the filtered.xsl. So that filters.xsl is what's going to tell us how the data that we receive should be transformed. Okay. We now want to look at how we would use the HTTP adapters with SOAP services. So the SOAP-based service would need to use a SOAP envelope, and it can be created and sent directly using the WL server invoke HTTP method. To invoke a SOAP-based service in an HTTP adapter, you need to encode the SOAP XML envelope with the request body. And then you need to, if you receive error messages about the SOAP envelope, you need to disable the JavaScript validator by going to Project, Properties, Builders, and clearing the JavaScript validator. So we'll use JavaScript to create a SOAP envelope, and you can see an example of that on the screen right now. So this is an example how we want to create the SOAP envelope in JavaScript. Now Then we can continue to insert the JavaScript code and variables into the SOAP XML, and these ones will get executed or evaluated at runtime. So right there in your envelope, you can actually add JavaScript code. And here we can see WL server configuration, local.ip address, all of that we are putting into our SOAP envelope, and that will get executed or evaluated at runtime. Now, using the WL server invoke HTTP method, we are now able to invoke a request for a SOAP service. Now, the options must include the following properties. We've seen that already. The method is a must, which is going to be post or get, because those are the two supported. The return content type, usually XML. The path, a service path. The body, and the content, and then the content type. So we have all of these ones being included for a SOAP service. So this snapshot is giving us a full SOAP-based service invocation procedure. We have the SOAP envelope as the first part. We have the options, and then finally the request invocation.